Hello and welcome back. In this video we're going to be making a dartboard case out of some lumber that I had milled up ages ago in preparation for this project. I let it acclimate to the shop for a few months. With cutting wood that thin, you do get some warping and some bending. So I'd cut it and then had it stickered up and clamped down to minimize that twist. You can see I have some walnut and some maple I'm going to use for this project. Start out by taking it over to the joiner and cleaning up the faces that I previously made. There is some of that warping over time, so this just cleans them up and gets some fresh faces on. I start with the edges and work them down until everything is square. And then I take a passing face on the other side. Now over to the table saw to trim up that other side of that board to make everything square. I'm just trimming off a minor amount just to get rid of the saw marks from previously and some of the joiner marks. This just gets the board nice and square and has a good final finish. Now I'm doing some layout here on this maple to get rid of that part that couldn't get planed. So I just did some eyeballing and see what I can use to best cut that off and remove the bulk of it. And there's still a little bit left there that'll get removed in other operations. Same thing with these maple boards, just cleaning up that other side of that short edge there and getting everything square. And same here, this was relative dimensioning. I looked at what made sense to cut off and the minimum I can get away with, and that's what I rolled with for dimensions. Now cross-cutting back at the table saw. This is just squaring up one of those edges, removing some of the material from snipe from previous steps that I didn't like. Now measuring up for my final side length here. These walnut pieces will compose the casework and the maple will be the front. Cutting everything at 19.5 just to give me a little extra room. As a standard size dartboard, I believe is like 18 3/4. So this gives it a little extra room. Now I'm making those final cuts back at the crosscut sled. You can see I've moved over to get a perfect cut there. I just removed that line. I leave a little fraction of it left on the board, as you can see here. Now I'm going to glue up the top. I have this maple that I ripped from 2 boards. I cut them both in half. So I staggered them with is a mirror image, so it's somewhat book matched as you look across the board. Some very light glue on the seams, and I use some squeeze clamps on the edges there just to kind of keep everything aligned while I pull the clamps in. And I use some of these longer clamps as well in the center to push those joints together to keep everything relatively flat. Now I've removed the clamps and you can see there's a little bit of raised edges and some glue squeeze out that I have to clean up with some sanding. I start with an orbital sander just to kind of get a look at what I have to remove. This probably was about a 32nd of an inch at the most, 1/16 of an inch maybe on the edges at some points. So I just have to work those edges down. The orbital sander really isn't for removing a lot of material. It just lets me see where I'm as a starting point. Coming in with the belt sander this way is the best way I found to remove material and keep everything relatively flat by continuing to move along those seams and not focusing on just the high spots and trying to get an even finish across. This does most of the bulk of the removal. Now I'm laying out here back on the casework for the finger joints. I'm pre-cutting on both sides of the piece, so when I do finger joints it doesn't blow out the material. And do some layout here with all these tapes being on the inside of the piece, just to keep everything aligned and all set in your head. Now here I am using the box joint jig that I've made, very similar to other designs. Here's kind of, you can see a close-up of how it works. Just advancing every time onto that little peg and using a dado blade to cut that box joint. See how pre-cutting that edge allows the piece a clean break-off point so it doesn't break into your piece where it'll be seen. Now I'm cutting the opposite side where I'm removing a tooth from the top as opposed to leaving a full tooth that's a missing one at the top. And then you just advance along the box joint jig the same way. And those opposite faces get the same cut, whether it's a tooth or a missing tooth. Now I'm doing just some final sanding here before I glue everything up. Pre-finishing the inside with, at least with sanding, makes it easier for the final glue up because it's difficult to sand on the inside. Now gluing up all these fingers, this is a pretty stressful process because there's a lot of glue surface area. And this glue starts to set up pretty quick with all that area in contact. So you have to work pretty quickly to get everything together. Tapping everything in gently with a mallet there gets me a nice snug fit. These box joints are very strong, a very solid joint. The only reason you would clamp them usually is if you are a little loose or just to keep everything square, because these can dry out of square if you're not careful. So I use these purely just to get everything square, and then once the glue starts to set up, I can remove it. Now I'm just showing a close-up of sanding off the pins here. I do a technique with the orbital sander like this, where I run it on an angle and just touch the tops of those pins, so that once they start to get closer, then I can even the sander out and make a finished pass on both sides. That keeps you from sanding down all your top material and just focuses on those pins. Now jumping over to the router, I'm cutting the inside slot, which will receive the back panel. It's inset about 1/8 of an inch, just so there's a slight backing sticking out, so I have a solid connection to the wall. And that'll make more sense later. Trimming up the corners here, as the bit cannot get in there with the chisel. I just work it from both sides to remove that round, so that the square back panel can fit in snugly and get a lot of glue surface area. Now I'm cutting my back panel. I'm just using a 1/8 inch piece of red oak back plywood just because it's what I have on hand, and most of it will be hidden by the dartboard anyway, so I'm not worried about the contrasting wood. So I cut it roughly to width, and since it's a square I do the same cut on both sides. I make it slightly oversized, and then I sneak up on the cut, taking off about less than a blade's width every time, and you can see that process here, showing what I'm going to remove. Make the cut, come back to the piece, mark it again, and repeat that process, sneaking up on it, removing from both sides until you have a perfect square that has a very tight fit for that back panel. And by keeping it square, if there is any movement still in your wood, you can put a piece back in square with this back panel. Now we're jumping back to the front of the case. I'm using this makeshift track saw to make these cuts as it's too wide for my table saw. I'm just squaring up one of these edges. I'm cutting about 98% through the piece and then moving my board underneath in so I have a better supported piece. Then I finish the cut through here, and that gives a nice finished edge with no tear out or splintering. And I'm going to repeat that process on the other side. I put all the cracking from the boards, or the worst of it, on this side. So I'm taking a heavier cut to remove that cracking on the edge of the boards and some other imperfections that I purposely put on this side of the glue up. So I'm just finding a spot that hides everything or removes all the bad parts. I'm going to make that same cut with that makeshift track saw. Except with this time, I'm running it straight through with the board in the correct position. Measuring from the center of the board outwards, equidistant from both sides, I can mark the edges of the board and make those cuts individually. And I repeat that on both sides. So this is part 1 of this video series. I'll have one more part coming out shortly after I complete the case. As always, thank you for watching. And if you have any other videos you'd like me to make, please leave them in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you.